Hello, all. Welcome back. Okay, first of all, this is going to be lecture 9, Brazil. Second of all, I was sick over the weekend, and then I also forgot I had to go clean out my office at UTPB because of the renovations. So I'm a little late on the lectures. So I'm going to extend the exam by 2 days. So I don't know what that makes it. Let me see. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Um, Well, I'm not sure, but you will see that I will extend the exam by 2 days, and then I'll get caught up for Unit 3. Okay, so let's talk about Brazil. Let me get back to where I was. Okay, um, this is a pretty interesting chapter. Brazil's a really interesting state. It's of course one of, if not the biggest economy in Latin America. Probably competes with Mexico. I'm guessing they're, I'm not sure which one's bigger, but probably Mexico. Anyway, Brazil's a really big economy. It runs a lot of the trade in South America. Um, Again, they're a really good example of ISI. They have a really good example of sort of the military dictatorship problem that we know of that was happening from, say, the 50s to the 80s in Latin America. So, very cool state to study. They're also very different from most of the rest of Latin America, right? Because they're a Portuguese colony and not a Spanish colony. Um, but anyway, let's get into it. So we're going to skip through section 1, jump right into section 2, the historical framework for analysis, right? Um, I usually don't do a lot of history, but since we're talking about Latin America and this is more of a case study class, we're going to have a little more history than usual. So we are going to touch on some of the history of some of these countries because it sort of sets up the context for contemporary politics. So basically, Dom Pedro declares independence from Lisbon. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal. Um, and Brazil is born in 1822, right? And Dom Pedro declares a monarchy. Um, for the vast majority of Brazilian politics, everything has been very oligarchic, led by the elites in society. There's very rarely any sort of quick political changes. Uh, it's also been exceptionally peaceful for a Latin American country, right? They haven't really had any civil wars. They've never really been in wars with their neighbors. They just sort of have a non alignment policy where they don't really get involved all that much. They were sort of late to the game in ending slavery. They did not end slavery in Brazil officially until 1888. Um, you should also know that there's an enormous gap between the wealthy or the elites, whatever you want to call it, and the poor or the middle class in a lot of things, right? Social services, access to electricity, internet, food, water, um, educational resources, right? The elites get great education, the poor get poor education, right? Life expectancy, poverty, all of these sorts of things. There's a vast disparity between the best off in Brazil and the worst off in Brazil. Um, and this continues to this day. I would also say, like we were talking about earlier, it's been an elite driven sort of nation um, with a very sort of machismo attitude towards leadership, right? Uh, we're also going to talk about the military coup. It starts in 1964, and then they finally give up power in 1985. This is really the point, the third wave of democracy. We're seeing all of Latin America democratize after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We see most of Eastern Europe democratize. So this is a big movement in the 80s and 90s. But the military takes over in 1964 because ISI is not working. There's huge levels of economic malaise, right? There's high unemployment, high inflation. The country is extremely polarized at this point. Uh, and so the military takes over, and the sort of dictatorship under Brazilian military dictatorship was different than you find in places like Peru and Argentina and Colombia. Um, where those were very violent and repressive regimes. The Brazilian military dictatorship was pretty like bureaucratic and professional. Yes, there were some human rights violations and things like that, but nowhere to the extent that you see in Argentina and Chile and Peru and places like that. Okay. Um, we're also going to talk about Lula. He is their current president. He was their president for like 10 years. And then he had to hand off the presidency to Dilma Rousseff, who was basically his hand-picked successor. But and then Dilma Rousseff really screwed up and kind of led to the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, the far right leader who was there before Lula recently won the election again. Um, So the society in Brazil is largely patrimonial and elitist. But in 2002, Lula wins election. He's this former shoeshine boy. I mean, he comes from nothing, right? And then he eventually becomes a union leader. And then eventually he becomes the leader of the Workers' Party, the PT in Brazil. You know, he's this very famous, very charismatic man. Um, and I think his full name is Inácio Lula da Silva. And, you know, everybody just calls him Lula. He was a really responsible leader post 2002. Yes, he's a leftist, but he didn't really carry out like extreme leftist policies. He was very careful about inflation and borrowing and using reserves from oil money that they had found in a smart way. And yet, he also had some really profound social welfare programs for the very poorest people, usually in the Northeast and usually living in the favelas Sao Paulo, Brasilia, places like that, um, where basically they were handing out cash transfers as long as you get your kids to school and as long as you go to your health checkups every year, then you know you'll get your payout, and it reduced poverty dramatically. Inequality hasn't really changed much, but extreme poverty has been reduced uh, really well. Unfortunately, Lula had to leave because of their term limits in the Constitution, and he sort of picked this woman, Dilma Rousseff, who was his like chief of staff. She didn't have a lot of political experience, but then like corruption just exploded her administration. So we'll talk about that too. Okay, section three: political institutions and culture. Um, Brazil is interesting because it has mandatory voting, right? You must vote by law. You know, you don't actually have to vote. Like nobody's going to put a gun to your head or whatever, but like you can pay a small penalty, like 20. You know, you pay a $20 fee or whatever because you didn't show up and vote and do the you know what do you call it, your civic duty or whatever. But you can also like if you show up to vote, you can cast a blank vote. It's widely talked about in political science as a protest vote. Like, I don't want to vote for anyone. I'm here to vote and say that, like, I'm a citizen, but all of these choices sort of disgust me, right? So, and protest votes are growing in Brazil and across South America, where some elections, anywhere from 20 to 35% of votes are protest votes or people who just abstain. um, so you know, it's a sign that there's growing frustration with the system and the choices that do exist. Brazil does have free and fair elections. A lot of their elections are based on PR, which we'll talk about. They also have high respect for their term limits, so there are sort of institutional checks and balances in place in Brazil that don't exist in places like right Honduras, El Salvador, you know, some of the Venezuela, some of the more concerning states. There are two main parties. The PT, which we talked about, the Workers' Party, a leftist party under Lula, mostly tied to unions, and then the PSDB, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, which is more of a right wing party, right? Um, but I would also say there's like 40 parties in their system. It's absurd because of the way they run their elections, their open list PR system. Um, you know, what happens is you show up to the poll, you can vote either party, or you can vote for one of the candidates inside the party, right? So there's 30 freaking parties. all of them have 5 candidates each, right? That's 150 candidates just from your local jurisdiction. You got to figure out who you want. Do you want to vote for the party? Do you want to vote for the individual? The problem is when you open up the list and say, well, you can not only vote for the party, but you can just vote for this specific person inside the party. It causes intra-party competition, right? And so not only are you out there saying my party is better than the other parties, right? I have um, the ideological winning argument, right? But also I'm better than the guy who's part of my party. He's an asshole and he thinks the wrong things, and that causes real problems, right? And so there's real problems with trying to get even your own party members to agree on the same thing when you do get elected to Congress, and because there's so many parties, it means that you have to build coalitions in Congress, right? You don't just have a one majority party like in England or like in the United States who's in control of the legislature. You have 12 parties out of 23, say, that have to all cobble together a coalition to make a majority. That can be really messy. And that just strengthens and emboldens the president. Uh, okay, so Section 4 is about corruption. Corruption has always been a major problem in Brazil forever, basically. There's very little party control, like we talked about, right? Everything is very candidate centered. And so there's a lot of like payouts, right? There's a lot of vote buying. There's a lot of shifting national resources to your local district to try to win over votes. Um, and there's very little party control because of that open-less PR system, because there's a weak legislature, because there's so many parties and coalition government has to exist, but also because they have not only a sort of federal system, but a three-level federal system in the Constitution. As far as I know, it's the only one in the world like that where rights are divvied out not only to the national government, but to the state government and even to the municipal government, right? And so who has power over what is quite a mess sometimes. Let's see. In 2005, there was a huge corruption scandal, and this was while Lula was still in office. And it's called the Mensalao scandal, where um, Lula's party was basically just paying monthly payments to legislators to say, hey, if you vote for this legislation, I'll write you a check every month. And if you don't, I'll cut you off, you know? And so most people were just signing on to his stuff. And then in 2014, when you had Dilma Rousseff was the leader, you had what's called Lava Jato, which is the car wash scandal. I don't really know why they called it that, but basically, what investigators found out was that anyone who was running any kind of contract with the state-owned oil company, right, Brazilian state-owned oil company, which is not sort of hasn't been liberalized and sold off, was receiving 1 to 3% boosts in their contracts as just skim money. So, so Petrobras was paying 1 to 3% over anything basically from all their suppliers and all of their sort of the people who run their administration, the people who fix their wells, all of this stuff. They're paying a 3% premium just for payout money, and hundreds of legislators are wrapped into this. Dozens go to prison. It was a mess. Um, and like 50 to 60% of all the legislators in Brazil are always under indictment. It is bizarre. They're either under investigation or under indictment. And we're talking about the majority of legislators in every single legislative session. So it's pretty wild. They also have massive expenditures on state and municipal government corruption, right? So they're paying out huge salaries to a bloated bureaucracy. They're giving away free health care to anyone who's part of the government. They have these slush funds that we just talked about, like from Petrobras. Um, the local and whatever legislators often get free or subsidized trips and flights and vacations, and they call them conferences or whatever. Americans do that too. Don't get me wrong. Um, and then another problem is that the federal officials and anyone who is a legislator in the Congress, they cannot be tried by regular courts. They can only be tried by the Supreme Court. So this gives them another sort of degree of protection. And basically, the only checks and balances on any of these politicians is, at least recently, the public prosecutor's office, which has really strengthened itself, and the Supreme Court, which has also said, like, we're not putting up with this BS. We are an independent and co-equal branch, and we will put you in prison if you screw around. So, yeah, they have really shifted their weight around a lot. The judicial system in Brazil in recent years. Okay, section 6 is about the economic evolution. During colonial times, of course, they had a slavery system because they had a lot of sugar plantations, and sugar was very labor intensive. We talked about in Argentina, they didn't have a huge slavery population because they had ranches. Well, Brazil was very different, right? It's agricultural. They started a shift in the 18th century to mining and gold and coffee, especially. And then in the early 20th century, during the World Wars, they were really pushing coffee and rubber, right? There needed to be rubber for this new sort of industrialized system. They're making gaskets, they're making tires for vehicles, they're making all this stuff for motorcycle wheels and for the World Wars efforts. Okay, we know all about ISI. I'm going to kind of skip over some of that. In the 1980s, the military, has been in charge since 1964. Um, they start to really, they start to really be concerned about inflation, right? Because they're in heavy debt, like we talked about, because of ISI. They've got this bloated bureaucracy. They're in heavy debt. Inflation starts to really kick in. So the military government, they peg prices to inflation, right? And they say, okay, bread can only rise by as much as inflation is rising, right? And we'll also tag your salary to inflation. So you kind of get away with the problem because as long as people can pay for the inflation, they're not all that unhappy about it, right? But the problem is you're sort of building automatic inflation into the system. You're saying we're just going to live with it forever, and it really started to become a serious problem. They had all these state-run firms, this bloated bureaucracy. They could not manage it by tinkering around the edges anymore. Um, and so in the 90s, this guy named Fernando Henrique Cardoso, very, very famous Brazilian, becomes the finance minister in 1994. And he begins to sort of fix the problem. It's called the Real Plan. And they eventually adopted the Real as their currency. Uh, so what they did is they generate a new currency and they tie it to the US dollar until they can sort of build their own and print off reals, right? And so this helps to stabilize inflation doesn't really occur with the US dollar, right? And so they're trying to stabilize their currency. Um, they rein in government spending dramatically, right? They rein in the spending on these sort of bloated bureaucracy. They start releasing some people from the government. They also rein in their spending on sort of national darling industries, right? And so they're cutting government spending, and then they introduce the real, and things really start to kick off in the late 90s as investment dollars start flooding in, right? Because they finally have an economy that is stable and predictable. And so then Lula gets elected in 2002, as we talked about. Again, he was a leftist, but he promised to keep spending under control because he saw this Brazilian miracle coming. He introduced what was called Bolsa Familia, which is, build the family. That cash transfer program that we talked about earlier, where if your kids go to school and they show up for their yearly checkups, you get a payout. Uh, and it usually only goes on a card, and it only can go to the mother, which is really interesting because apparently men go out and buy booze and drugs and stuff. So, like, there are studies; it's pretty wild. Um, they've also boosted the minimum wage, right? And so they reduced poverty dramatically in Britain. I mean, in Britain, in Brazil, education, they start pumping education into the worst schools, and education starts to improve drastically, especially since you have to be present to receive your Bolsa Familia payments. And their health outcomes start to improve dramatically, right? And then China becomes in the early 2010s becomes their biggest trade partner, and things are just booming, right? So they're shipping out beef, pork, and especially soybeans. But unfortunately, in 2015, China's economy starts to sputter, and it really hits Brazil hard, and they start to go into a recession. um, Things are going pretty well right now for Brazil. It's one of the more stable democratic countries in Latin America. But there are still problems like violence, right? They have about 10% of the world's murders happen in Brazil every year. There are still these massive favelas and huge inequality. So if you look at pictures of Rio de Janeiro or Brasilia or other places, especially urban populations, you'll see it kind of looks like South Africa, where there's extraordinarily wealth and then there's miles of shanty town behind it, where people don't even have access to running water or toilets or electricity. So it's pretty rough. um, I would also say on the international front, I should at least mention that they're a member of the BRICS. So the BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, right? BRICS. Um, and the BRICS are trying to sort of develop their own way, right? They're frustrated with the Cold War. They're frustrated with the bipolar state of the world. They're frustrated with the way that the U.S. sort of pushes their weight around, and so they don't really want to get caught up in this ideological fight or pick a side, say between China, Russia, and the U.S., Europe, right? They want to sort of develop their own path. And so South Africa, India, Brazil, Argentina, some of these middling states are really trying to sort of pick their own third way, this purposefully ambiguous way. So it's something that's interesting to watch on the international scene. So anyway, that's the end of Brazil. Thanks for being here. I'll get the rest of these up today. Have a great day.